All right, ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to another episode of the Mike Maven podcast, episode 93. We are 7 away from the century mark. We're closing in. If you haven't checked out the last episode, it was the debut of a new miniseries, The E-Men, inside the NYPD's Emergency Service Unit. And we had retired NYPD Emergency Service Sergeant John Lampkin on as he discussed the 13 years he did in ESU, being a sergeant in Truck 1 and Truck 2 in Manhattan. Did a lot and talked about trying to lead the ESU in the days after 9/11, in which 14 of its members were lost. So we continue with the law enforcement theme with this episode with my next guest, who's a man who spent 22 years with the NYPD, joined the force in 1979. He'd carve out an impressive career that would conclude in early 2001. It would be in 1991 that his career would become especially interesting, as he'd spend the next decade until his retirement working in the money laundering unit, as well as the organized crime investigation division, as an original member of the El Dorado Task Force, a federal effort consisting of numerous agencies cracking down on money laundering. He's still active in that since 2003. He served as the president of AML Consulting, Inc., providing assistance and consultation, as well as protecting organizations from the threat of money laundering. It's retired Lieutenant Ron Rose, and he joins me now on the Mike Maven podcast. Ron, happy to have you. Welcome. How are you?
Thanks, Mike, and thanks for having me on.
No problem. So the first question is always an easy one. Where did you grow up? What was your childhood like?
Well, my childhood was a very typical, normal, I guess, childhood, as normal as any are. I was born in Washington Heights. We moved from there when I was young, about 5 years old, moved to Howard Beach. I lived there, I guess, for about 7 years till the middle of my first year of junior high school. Then we moved out to Long Island, and I spent the rest of my junior high school and high school years there. Then when I went to college, I split my time between Flushing and out on Long Island, depending on when school was in or out and things like that. And then when I came on the police department, I just stayed in Flushing, was there for a number of years, and eventually moved back out to Long Island.
Okay. So tell me, when did you first take an interest in the idea of joining law enforcement?
Probably was the later years of my high school years, maybe junior, senior year, something like that. When everybody, parents, guidance counselors, whatever, are asking you, well, what are you going to do? And you had to pick something. And I come from a family of teachers. My parents were both teachers. My mother's two sisters were teachers. One of them was married to a principal. So there was always the education component, but I personally was never too hopped up on school and going to school. So let's just say I wasn't going to get any perfect attendance awards. But then it came time where you had to decide what to do. And I didn't have any other particular skills. And at that time, I spent my time hanging out like a lot of kids do, in our cars down by the beach, wherever we might congregate. And, every so often the police would come by and check us out, move us along, whatever they might do. And I had a friend whose father was a local police officer, and he'd just be hanging out with us in the same places we were hanging out. And then it occurred to me, I knew I never wanted to work in an office, 9 to 5, indoors, anything like that. So then I said, you know what? These guys are getting paid to hang out in the same places I'm hanging out. So maybe that wouldn't be such a bad thing to do. And I didn't really want to necessarily go to college, but of course I had to push from the parental side for that. And there was no hiring going on at that time. We're talking, I graduated from high school in 1974. So there was a lot of the fiscal crisis going on, certainly in the city and elsewhere. So I had to do something. So I went to school and until the police test came up in 1979.
Now, we'll get to what you did in the anti-money laundering division later on in the show, but I have to say, given the fact that you would spend so much time still work in that, were you always interested in the financial industry as well, or did that just come to you later on?
No, it's just kind of the way things developed. I didn't have any interest in anything financial other than having a few dollars in my pocket to spend.
Right.
But other than that, I didn't have any experience. Like I said, there was no real family background in that area. It's just kind of came about. The only kind of little background I had was when I first graduated from college. A few months after I graduated, I got a job with the Inspector General's office of the New York City Department of Finance. But I didn't really do any financial work there. But there was a white collar crime course that was given by the DOI, Department of Investigation, that all the Inspector General investigators went through. So I got a little bit of a background there. The one thing I can remember that still sticks with me from that course was just how to read a check and what information is contained on a check, and things like that. But other than that, and up until 1992, nothing else financial related in between.
Okay, so academy life is interesting because I know to my listeners sometimes I may sound like a broken record asking this question, but every experience is different, which is why I asked this question. So around this time in 79, 80, that timetable, you got three different departments: transit, housing, and the NYPD. So after a while, they would start just doing strictly the NYPD Academy. And then if you went out to housing, you went out to housing. If you went out to transit, you went out to transit. But at this time, it wasn't quite that way yet. So for you getting into the academy, what was it like? And was there a specific department that you wanted, or did you not care?
Well, definitely my focus was the NYPD. I hadn't really given any thought to housing or transit. But as you mentioned, at that time, we all went through the same academy together. There was no separate academy. I believe that the transit guys and maybe the housing guys, they went to another training session or academy after the regular academy that gave them the particulars of working, in the trains or in the housing projects or things like that. But we were all together, and I never really thought of any of the others. If I would have got put in them, I would have just went along with it. But before I went in the academy, I wasn't necessarily sure I wanted to come on the police department itself. There was, they say it's a paramilitary organization, I needed uniform. I wasn't sure how I would take to that. So in fact, when I was going through my investigation, at one point I told my applicant investigator that I didn't think I was going to take the job. And then he just said, well, I'm going to leave your name on the list. And if you feel like showing up on November 7th to get sworn in, then just show up. And I thought about it and I said, all right, I'll do it. And I'll give the job 5 years and see how it goes.
You stayed an extra 17 after that, so I guess it went well.
Yeah, it was going pretty good, so I stuck around for a while.
So, every person that's coming on the job, rather it be the fire department, rather it be the police department, you got to look for the senior man. You're trying to learn, even if it's indirectly, even if you're just listening to the conversations, that's how you can own your craft. So first, this is a two-part question. Where were you originally assigned? Were you assigned to an NSU out of the academy? And when you were, if you were, who were the senior guys or even gals that helped you learn the job?
So I was assigned to NSU 16 out of the academy. That's, I guess, like Northwestern Queens, Astoria, Jackson Heights, Woodside, Glendale, Ridgewood, the 114, the 110. There was no 115 then, the 108 and the 104. So those are the precincts that we covered. And it was great because there was a little bit of everything in there, and we were in those different places all the time. And I've been lucky my whole career, but I was especially lucky then to have some great FTOs, the field training officers. And I can still remember, I think his first name was Richie Sheridan and Ron Marmion and Basil Saragusa. And you have to remember, we were the first class to come out since the layoffs. So the same in the academy and with the FTOs, everybody was kind of eager to get back to those kind of things. But those guys were great. They were, super experienced. They were patient. They explained everything to you, and they just set great examples. They were great role models. I can remember making my first gun collar in the Ravenswood project with Detective Sheridan. I can still remember that. I've been very lucky throughout my whole career. All my partners, all the members of my teams, whether it was in PMD or in the money laundering unit, I've always been surrounded by really sharp, good people, hard workers, and I've just been very lucky that way.
Quick aside here, we're talking about Ron Rose, retired lieutenant here on the Mike Maven podcast. He joined the Dorado task force in 92. I said 91, so apologies for that. For my listeners, you can dock me 5 points on that little homework assignment there. It's definitely an interesting thing because I had a homicide detective on the show a while ago who said that coming out after those layoffs as the new kids on the block, so to speak, it filled the older guys who were kind of jaded from the layoffs. It filled them with energy and life again because they saw these young kids that were so eager to do the job, and it reminded them of why they took the job in the first place. Did you see that with your FTOs and the older guys?
Yeah, I mean, the FTOs, and I'm sure they were selected for, for a variety of reasons, but one being that, they weren't that disgruntled. They were eager to do it. I don't know if they were all volunteers or they were drafted. I don't remember that. And, there were disgruntled guys around, and you can't blame them.
Right.
They took this job. There had never been layoffs in history. All of a sudden, they're laid off. Um, but as you mentioned, kind of everybody came around a bit. I mean, listen, not everybody in the police department is always 100% happy, happy with the job. But the layoffs just added something else to that. But yeah, they were happy to see us. They were happy to have somebody else take some of the crummy jobs, away from them, sticking with the new guy, which is par for the course. That's the way it goes.
Right.
Low man on the totem pole. So now they were no longer the low man on the totem pole, even though they had come up a little bit and they had to go back to the bottom. Now they were able to move up again a little bit. It opened up movement within the job, where there was nobody new coming in. So for the specialized units, it was probably even more difficult to get in because there was no place to move. So it opened things up for them. So I'm sure that made them a little bit happier and a little bit happier with the job when that happened. So yeah, you could see that happen. And some people were going to stay disgruntled. That's just the way some people are. But generally, as you said, you see people to get some renewed enthusiasm here and there.
Absolutely. So, it's interesting. Everybody in any job, it doesn't have to be necessarily the job that you had, everybody has ambitions of some sort. I want to do this. I want to do that. And that's a good thing. It's a healthy thing as long as you keep it in the proper perspective. So, I mean, when you come on the job, some people just want to stay in patrol their entire career. And there's nothing wrong with that. There's plenty to do in patrol. Some people want to go to the detective bureau. Some people want to be in a boss-like position, sergeant, lieutenant, captain. Did you always aspire to be a boss, or how did the path to you eventually becoming a lieutenant come about?
So coming on the job, becoming a boss was never a thought in my head, really. And as I mentioned, I wasn't even sure I really wanted to take this job. I said, I'm going to see how it goes. And so, I just took it as a commitment. And then, it turned out it was great. I was having a great time. As far as, promotion, civil service promotion, it was kind of like the tests come up. So you take it. I didn't really think about it. You knew it was a little extra money. It was some more money. Also, it was one less layer of people to tell you what to do. So, you can go up above, hop above that one layer of people telling you what to do. So it just was like a thing to do. And, pretty much everybody that was in my class that I came on with, they were pretty much all taking the test, at least the guys that I knew of. I'm sure it wasn't 100%. If they didn't take that test, they might have taken a subsequent test. And then it was that was for the sergeant's test, which, by the way, was one of the hardest tests I ever took.
I've heard.
Back then it was 1984, I guess. The legal questions and things. I thought it was like a mini bar exam for that test. And I had taken a lot of tests before then, and that was a pretty hard one. And then the next thing that came up was the lieutenant's test. So it's just like a logical progression. You do have to consider, though, where you are and understand that in the police department, when you get promoted, the odds are that almost definitely you're going to have to move from where you are, at least for a little while. But that's not always a bad thing. But sometimes you're in a comfortable spot and you think you don't want to move. But that really was, I was in a good spot at that point. Also, I was in PMD as a sergeant and took lieutenant's test, and I got bounced around a little bit after that before I was able to get back. So all those things come into the equation, but it's kind of like just there's a test, you take it. The only thing that was a little wrinkle was I took the captain's test and I passed it, and I ended up declining that promotion. Mm-hmm. So it's the same kind of thing. You kind of realize where you're at, what do you really want to do. What will you be happiest doing? So at that time I was in OCID, in the money laundering unit, doing a lot of interesting things, having fun. And I never really had any desire to become like a chief or a police commissioner, because then to me, you were just getting further and further away from what you really like to do. You become more of an administrator, more of a bureaucrat. And I just never really had a lot of interest in that.
Blame you. I mean, I had Chief Anamona on a while ago, and it's like, I don't know how he put up with it at the end. He talked about the issues he was having towards the end of his tenure when he left in '99. And I just don't know. I mean, it takes a thick-skinned person to put up with the kind of nonsense that happens at the highest levels. But no, it reminds me, it's funny you say that, because I don't know if you ever watched the show Homicide: Life on the Street, which was a great cop show from the 90s. Al Giardello's character, at the end of the series, I think he got promoted to captain. He'd wanted it for years. He'd been a lieutenant for years. He just didn't show up to his promotion ceremony because he figured, you know what, I like homicide. And he stayed in homicide. So, and also another quick aside, because not everybody that listens to the show is a former member of the police or police buff like yours truly. I said NSU, that's a neighborhood stabilization unit for those that don't know. It's, you know, I don't know if it's the same now, but most cops back then would come out of the academy and go to a neighborhood stabilization unit in whatever neighborhood that they were assigned to throughout the 5 boroughs. So, you know, I've had a few people on that, in addition to doing what they were doing on the job, we're also going to school. And that's interesting because let's say, okay, even if you don't have a family life at home and you don't have any wife or children to attend to, it's still a lot of work at the job. And then it's a lot of work in school, and it's not an easy thing to juggle. So when you were doing that, especially as you moved up through the ranks, how did you manage to make sure that you were still able to do everything you had to do with the NYPD, but also still be a good student?
Yeah, I don't know if I was a good student, but I was a student. I got through it.
You got by, yeah.
I got by. So as I mentioned, I was never a real big fan of school, despite coming from a family full of educators. It just didn't interest me that much. But the time came to graduate high school. There wasn't a lot of hiring going on. I wasn't great at anything else. So, I went to college, and, my goal in high school was to just get through high school. Then my goal in college was to just get through college. Now, what helped there was, I went to John Jay undergraduate, and they had a hockey team, so I got to play on a hockey team. So that helped me, get through college there. My first 2 years were a little shaky, but then I realized, this school stuff is much easier if you actually show up. So my second 2 years were a lot better than my first 2 years. And then, I graduated, and it was time to look for a job. Again, things were pretty tight in the law enforcement world. And I got that job with the Department of Finance. So I was working at the Department of Finance in the Inspector General's office, and still looking around. I knew that wasn't going to be a permanent career, but it was a great first job. And I appreciate that they gave me the chance there right out of school. So I looked around, and at that time, there were a lot of jobs, particularly federal jobs, that if you had a graduate degree, a master's degree, you didn't have to take an exam. You could just apply when you had that degree. So I said, all right, I guess to get a better job, I'll have to go back to school. I'll go back. But I wanted to get it over with in a hurry. So I took a full course load in the graduate school. So this was in 1978, probably around there. Well, no, I went to work in 78 at the IG's office. Then 79, that first semester, I said, I'll go back to school. I took the full course load. But as that semester started in September or whatever, I then had taken the police test in June. They finally gave one in June of 79. So I took that, enrolled in the graduate school for September, and was working full time and going to school full time. And then came November 7th, and I got sworn into the police department. So now I was in the police academy Monday through Thursday. I was in the academy 8 to 4 and school from 5 to 9. Wow. And then go home on the subway. But, I was young then. I was 22. Didn't really think about it. It wasn't like a lot of fun, but it was kind of like just, you go along and you do it. And that was it. And I still went out, hung out, with my friends, did whatever I was normally doing. Maybe a little less of it. I guess I didn't need as much sleep back then. And just went like that. And then come January, after the first semester, I cut the course load back in half. So instead of taking 4 classes, I took 2 classes. And then basically within 2 years, by 81, I wrapped that up. But I was already on the police department, so
right.
It wasn't going to help me get another job. I guess it could have if I wanted it to, but I wasn't going anywhere at that point.
Well, I mean, it's funny you say that because I graduated college, right before the pandemic hit. I got out in the nick of time in December of 2019. And it's amazing, one of my classmates looked at me one day and he says, "How do you have so much energy?" Because, we would be in school until 3 o'clock. I'd go home, I'd do, the homework and the assignments that I have to do. And sometimes I took 4 or 5 classes. I'd take it at 10 o'clock at night. My head hits the pillow. I'm not out till midnight. It's just how I am. To then wake up at 6:30 in the morning and do it all over again. And I was fine. I loved it, but whereas if, I'm 21 now, if I was fast forwarding, 10, 20 years, would I be able to do it? No, I'd be dead. But, you can handle it at that age. So we'll get to 1992, and that is an interesting time for you, because by this point you got 13 years on the job. You've seen a few things, and you got some experience under your belt, and you're having a great time. And that is when you arrive to the money laundering unit. And I'll set the stage because it's interesting, the way our minds work. When you think about money laundering, you think about, oh, well, drug dealers or the mafia doing things like that. And that does happen, as we'll discuss, but there's so much more to it. But first, how did the opportunity for you to get to the money laundering division open up, and to take us from there?
Okay, so before I went into OCID, into the money laundering unit, I was in public morals division, another part of OCCB. And that's where you did gambling, loan sharking, the alcohol violations, prostitution, and things like that. So I had gotten involved in some long-term investigations there with more traditional organized crime, because it was the gambling and the loan sharking, and we ended up doing a pretty big investigation, and we were up on wires. And it was the state version of RICO, OCA, it was called then. I imagine it still is, Organized Crime Control Act. So I was doing that. And then there was the Colombo War, the Colombo family war in 91. And after they killed the wrong kid in the bagel shop, everybody kind of got fed up, particularly the Brooklyn DA, who was DA Hines at the time. And they wanted to really crack down and put some pressure on organized crime, particularly the Colombo family, but any organized crime family. So they created a task force, but it was actually split into two parts. So OCID and the FBI teams, they had the job of following around the OC guys, trying to catch them with guns, putting pressure on them that way. And then they decided to try to hit them where they make their money. So that's the gambling, the prostitution, and things like that. So one day I got a call to come down to a meeting at headquarters. And when I got down there, there's a lot of people in the room, from narcotics, other places in OCCB, the detective bureaus, just a lot of people in there. And they said, okay, the DA wants this pressure put on. We're going to put together, like a task force. We're going to go after them. We want to hit everything we can. Long story short, somebody then turned around and said, all right, Ronnie, you're going to run it. And so I'm just sitting there like a deer in the headlights. I don't know why they picked that. Probably had discussions before and other people got out of it. And then so I was the one that was stuck with it. But it turned out to be a great opportunity. And it was a great thing. It really shows what the NYPD can do when they want to put their mind to it. So they said I forget if I was 30 people or 50 people from everywhere in the job, the DA's investigators from Brooklyn, New York State Police contingent, and they just said, all right, this is like Thursday, they're showing up Monday, get ready to roll. So, I had to put together all the organization, the administrative part, and figure out what to do. And basically told these guys, now they came from everywhere, from the detective bureau, they had prior PMD experience from elsewhere. I said, anything you knew from before, any locations, any informants you had, ring them up again. Let's get going. And everybody just did an unbelievable job. And we would go in 6 days a week. And it just became a machine, basically. As far as we hit all a lot of the wire rooms, the sports betting rooms. And it was near around Super Bowl Sunday. So they really wanted to put an emphasis on that. So we came up with a bunch of wire rooms that we hit. And we came up with the name King's Flush, which I think for several years after, on Super Bowl Sunday, if you look in the papers, they'll see they still did, they did a King's Flush operation. And it became the kind of thing where the detectives would hit, you do the warrants on those wire rooms. Then they would hit the phones that were in those wire rooms and get the number for other wire rooms that were being laid off to, or things like that. Come in the next morning, make a phone call to those numbers. You didn't have to make a bet, you just had to get the betting line, was good enough. go right back down to the DA's office. They were there ready to write up the search warrants. And that night, boom, we went out again. And we just did it night after night after night. And same thing, horse rooms, which are, like the illegal OTBs, except they're nicer than OTB. And we would just go, guys that knew places or whatever, we'd send somebody in, make a bet. Then when we go there and do the warrant, we took the satellite dishes off the roof. Back then it was all satellite dish. And the big thing was the counterfeit chips they put in to steal the OTB signals to, broadcast the races on walls. And we have emergency service come and take those big dishes down from the roof and take these chips and just place after place after place, night after night. Joker poker machines. Then we eventually came up with a place, Mastermind Video, I think was the name. They were basically producing and servicing and distributing the Joker poker machines everywhere. So we were, from hitting, the bodegas and things like that and taking the machines out, we were eventually able to locate that place, that operation in Brooklyn. And we eventually did a search warrant on there. And besides taking all kinds of machines, they actually had a computer, which was rare that day. And we were able to get out a list of all the locations that they were distributing machines to. So that kind of became like a little cottage industry. So if there was a day where not much else was going on, we just send out a team with the list, walk in those places. If you see the machine, take it. And so that was ongoing. But anyway, it just shows when the job really wants to do something and get it done. They weren't worried about the overtime at that point. That came later. At first they tell me don't worry about it, but I knew sooner or later that
come into play.
That bill was going to come due. But for 3 months, basically 6 days a week, we did that. So anyway, getting back to how I ended up in the money laundering unit, there was an opening in OSID. And I had done all this, so I had contact with people in OSID and the OSID teams, because again, we were cross-referencing each other on this Colombo War stuff. Also, just quickly, we'd hit the social club, some of these guys' social club. There were arrest warrants for certain figures there. So we could use those warrants as an excuse to go in those clubs. And I would tell people, though, just go in, make the observations. If you see numbers, policy slips, if you see a Joker poker, don't do anything then. Come back, we'll get a search warrant, and we'll go back another time when these guys aren't ready for us. But anyway, you'd go in those clubs, and they had all, the Godfather posters on the wall and the wise guy posters on it. It was pretty funny. But anyway, went through that. So I knew some of those guys, I guess they knew me. And then there was a couple of openings, I guess, in OSID for lieutenants. And I was contacted and asked, would I want to come to OSID? And I might have had some discussions before that a little bit. So at that point, I had been in PMD 5 years, on and off with a little break for my promotion. I had done those gambling cases and now the King's Flush. So I said, yeah, sure, I'll go, something new, something a little different. There was no mention of what team I would be assigned to. So I just assumed I would go to one of the OC teams because that's what I had just spent the last 5 years doing. But as is typical in a police department, it doesn't really work out that way all the time.
Nah.
So I went there, I got transferred over there, and then the inspector said, okay, you're going over to customs with the money laundering unit. So at that time, it was sort of more informally El Dorado. It wasn't formally El Dorado, but there was like a task force over there. So one day it was Colombos and the next day it was Colombians, and that's it.
No, but that's sometimes, those transfers that you might think, I don't want to do this. I'm not really into it. Turns out to be the best thing. It turns out to be a great journey and a great door that opens up. And you mentioned the Colombo thing. It's interesting. I watched a documentary on that on YouTube a little while ago. I don't want to say the funny thing, but the interesting thing about that is that Greg Scarpa was running around literally dying, and he was still performing hits on people. Like the dude was like literally falling apart and still running around like a maniac, gunning people down. And if you don't know who Greg Scarpa is, for my listeners, go look him up. His nickname was the Grim Reaper. That's all I need to tell you. And the other thing about that is that it's such a time capsule. Because for me, I don't like gambling. I don't deal with it. I never will. Because if I work hard to get my money, why would I want to risk losing it? That's just my way of looking at it. But other people are different. It's that now, you see it on television, these apps, these commercials for it. They mention the line before the pre-games of every game now, like it's commonplace. But back then, I'll never forget, it's a funny scene in a Law and Order episode from 1997 that Lenny Briscoe and Ray Curtis are going in and busting the guy. And the guy's got an illegal phone line thing going on. And Lenny Briscoe picks up the phone. He's with some ESU guys. Nick's under 2.5. I'll take that. hangs up the phone. But back then, those were the kind of guys that you were getting off the streets. And so I'll ask you, the El Dorado task force name is interesting. How is that? I know this may seem like a silly question, but I'm curious, how did you guys come up with that name?
And I had no part in coming up with that name.
Okay.
And the task force was actually put together and formalized by the SAC at Customs at the time and the SAC from the IRS CID. They were the impetus behind it. They got it together. And I think they came up with the name. I would imagine it has something to do with, El Dorado was the city of gold.
Mm.
And we were dealing mainly, almost exclusively, but not completely, but with South Americans. So, Colombians in particular. So I would imagine that had something to do with how they came up with the name.
Now, as far as, I will say as a Hispanic man, I can say this as a Dominican man, particularly, Hispanics are crazy. We are a wild bunch. There's just has to be good things in which it depends on what we channel that craziness into. Like I've channeled it into this, and that's why I've turned out okay. Plus my mom will never let me veer off, and I'm scared of her in that sense, which is good. So there's that, but there's those that unfortunately use it for other stuff that maybe not be the best. So, listen, some people are really retaliatory. And sometimes you can see investigators working on big cases, they can try to intimidate them. They can try to threaten their family. They make it really, really personal. And that's a dangerous thing. So for you, what were the keys, not just for yourself, but obviously your investigators? Okay, do what you have to do, but make sure that you keep all the doors battened down so that they can't find an avenue to get you, intimidate you, and potentially throw away the case.
Yeah, it's funny how things go, though. I really think that the most dangerous things are not the higher level things. The higher level you go up, particularly with organized crime activities, even narcotics traffickers, it's more business. That's not a guarantee by any means. And you always deal with psychopaths.
Right.
So, there's no predicting what they're going to do. But in my mind, like buy and bust operations on the street are way more dangerous than us taking $1 million from somebody on the street. Listen, they're not happy. The people we took the money from, they were in danger. Their families were in danger. Not so much us. When we were in danger was times where they don't recognize you as the police. And then they think you're somebody coming to rip them off or something like that. That's something that always had to be guarded against. Make sure that, when we go to do something, that they knew we were the police and not somebody coming to just, rob them.
Right.
So, and of course, listen, you did put personal information out there. This is the days before Google and the internet. So, if you had an unlisted phone number, which I don't even think I'd bother to do, but, that was the best you could do. And you didn't put anything that connected you to being at your home, your residence, or where your family was. And if you kept it pretty isolated like that, again, the biggest danger was more of us getting ripped off when the undercovers were doing a deal, somebody coming to rip us off, or somebody else thinking we were going to rip them off when we came by. And as long as you could handle that pretty well. And of course, there was always a danger in these operations of other law enforcement being involved unwittingly. They don't know who you are. You don't know who they are. As you get to the top of the pyramid, the top of the food chain there, there's less and less targets. So there's a lot of crossover with one group's investigations will intersect with another group's investigations. And so you always had to guard against that. And there were deconfliction systems available. DEX was one, and then they set up one for money laundering as well. But not all the agencies were that diligent in using the systems. But that was an effort to try to make sure that no unfortunate incidents happen.
Right. And we're talking with Ron Rose here, the Mike Game podcast. He's been a great guest so far, and I've had a lot of fun chatting with him, because you mentioned the buy and bust. This is during the 90s. I'm sure the incidents in which Detective Luis Lopez was killed in March of 1993, and when Sean Carrington, 5 years later in January of 1998, both were detectives who were, it was different. They were getting narcotics off the streets, but they were gunned down during similar operations. Not by fellow law enforcement who didn't know they were cops, but by criminals. And obviously, those situations give you great pause as to how you approach your operation. So, again, I know this may seem like a silly question, and I apologize if it sounds that way. And you can explain this better than I ever could. I don't know if there's a specific way in which one launders money. I imagine there's different methods to it. So for you as an investigator, if I'm, running money illegally, which you would catch me easily because I'm a horrible liar, what are the clues that an investigator has to detect that tips off immediately? Okay, this is funny money.
Okay, so again, as you said, the money laundering could take many different forms at many different levels. So it depends where you're focusing your attention and what type of money laundering you're dealing with. So in El Dorado, a tremendous amount of the work was all undercover operations. So sometimes we posed as the person that could launder the money for the drug cartels, and sometimes we were the drug guys looking for somebody to launder the money. So
Nice.
they're what you would refer to as sting operations, mainly. So now when you're looking for the guy in the street, and the detectives in my team there, they were the best at this. So we'd have a target that we might have picked up money from before, and for a variety of reasons, there's no arrest made at that time. But that becomes a target to follow for future seizures and to see what else they're doing, to find the stash house and things like that. Now I'm going back to the days of beepers, and cell phones were just coming into play. So the technology's changed. So I'm sure some of the other things have changed. But these guys were the best at either spotting a prior target of ours or a car that was used before, and then following it, and then seeing, these guys would do a lot of counter surveillance actions. Go through red lights, go the wrong way on one-way streets, circle the block 5 times, just looking for surveillance, which of course a lot of times we were behind them. But so that's like a telltale sign. But the guy, by certain this doesn't exist anymore, but by certain payphones would be in certain neighborhoods, would be used by these guys to set up their meets and their drops and their pickups and things like that. So basically, they would get a call from, say, Colombia, and they would be told, "Oh, you're going to be getting a call from somebody," and a lot of times it would just be a code in a beeper, and it would be that code would correspond to a street and a time. So then the person would just show up there and look for the other person looking for them. But we became good at looking for them just as well as they did looking for each other. Or we'd see by the phone, you'd see the guy checking his beeper, looking around, walking up. Some of the detectives would go right up and get on the payphone right next to the guy, so they could overhear part of the conversation.
Smart.
And if it was somebody just telling them to pick up the laundry, all right, well, that's it, forget it. But a lot of times they could tell the guy was going to get ready to do a deal, and then we would just stay on him and surveil him. And, I take him hopefully to another drop. We could make a seizure, or back to a stash house where they'd come out with the money, and then, go back in and search that premises and find more money and do things like that. So that's one aspect to it. But then you've got the other side of it where, and the purpose of that is that they've got all that cash. They need to place it in the financial system somehow, right? So that money that would go in those pickups, it would go to either businesses that would write checks, or they could put it in their bank accounts and wire the money out and do things like that. And sometimes part of the undercover operations, we would be wiring the money out on their behalf to certain places. And then the next part of the job is, besides continuing with that target, is to trace with that and follow that money where it went. And then look at those accounts where that money was wired into, and see what else is going on, and then see if money could be seized, if asset forfeiture could be done, or seizure warrants could be done on those accounts. So that brings you to the next level, where the money's already been placed in the financial system. And that's where you're looking at accounts and you're looking for suspicious activity in those accounts. So in that instance, there are red flags, call them red flags. So they're indicators of possible suspicious activity taking place in the account. They're not automatic guarantees that this is money laundering, but they're indicators that there could be possible suspicious activity, money laundering going on. And so those are things would be like large cash deposits into account where that's not typical for that individual or that business. They don't normally do that, but all of a sudden there's a big cash deposit. You look at wire transfers going out. Sometimes you're looking for even round dollar amounts, a series of even round dollar amounts, sometimes all to the same party, sometimes to different parties. and often in a burst of activity happening very rapidly from the time the money comes in till those things go out. You look at things like shell company involvement in offshore jurisdictions, money going there, lack of transparency, who are involved in these transactions, who are the people, what is this for, what's the purpose, and you're unable to determine a legitimate purpose for the transactions. And there are a number of other things. So one thing is to look for the guys on the street that are either picking up money or dropping it off and doing a lot of surveillance work, a lot of hours in the car, and all over the place. They might, to clean themselves before a pickup or a drop, they might go from Queens to the Bronx to Westchester to Jersey, back to New York to a street corner in Manhattan or something to do it, and looking the whole time and just making turns and things like that. So, there was a lot of that. And, fortunately, the guys in the team were really good at that stuff. Sometimes they got away. Nothing's perfect.
Yeah.
But they were really good. And just to say, hey, being on surveillance for one thing, and then seeing a car go by and the guy would say, hey, that was the car from the pickup, 3 months ago at so-and-so corner. And if nothing was really happening where we were, either everybody break off or a few guys break off. All right, now go follow that target. And okay, now what's he doing? Is he clean? Is he washing himself? Is he going to that payphone? Is he standing on the corner looking around? Did he take a bag out of the trunk? Is he standing there with a bag? And like I said, those detectives are really sharp at picking up on those things.
And for my Colombian friends out there, listen, we're not picking on Colombia. We're not picking on Colombia. We're just using an example. Don't get mad at me, okay? There's a wonderful Colombian restaurant up the street from my house that has given me dinner many a night when mom could not cook. I love you guys. Do not take it personal. And the other thing is, yeah, of course. The other thing you mentioned, the last thing you mentioned was interesting in regards to legitimate organizations sometimes having illegitimate purposes. I'm not going to mention anything, but there's a story that's in the news about a certain organization in New York that you might know what I'm talking about. That one of their CFOs got busted recently for things that are alleged to have happened. I don't want to comment because it's an ongoing investigation. I don't want to put anything out there, but sometimes there's that too. And I remember somebody who will be on this show soon mentioning that in regards to the counterterrorism aspect of it, specifically, after 9/11, there were some cases where there would be legitimate organizations that would be sponsoring terrorism. And I don't know if you ran into any aspects of that during your time investigating money laundering, but there's another front, another avenue of money laundering in a very dangerous form.
No, absolutely. And as you said, the emphasis on terrorist financing really increased after 9/11. Before that, there were some people that were looking into it, but I could just give you an example of a difference in the outlook on that. So when I was in OCID, we would help other teams with warrants as they would help us sometimes on big cases or takedowns or things like that. And there's a district in Manhattan, I'll call it like the costume jewelry district, but they also have the t-shirt business and the counterfeit t-shirts and things like that. And there was a unit in OCID, the trademark infringement unit. And that's what they did. And when they would hit a warrant though, it was tractor trailers full of things that had to be taken. And this district in Manhattan, it's like around Broadway in the 20s and 30s, a little on Fifth Avenue, a little 6th Avenue. So as it turned out, years down the road, there was a lot of drug money laundering going down through there too. But anyway, we'd go help out on those warrants. So one time I was on the scene, and as guys were searching the office there, they came up with some paperwork, and they were receipts, and they were basically money remittance receipts. And it was money going to Lebanon. And it was like structured money that's, breaking big amounts into small amounts and things like that. But anyway, I think it was enough indication that there was something going on. So I reached out to the Joint Terrorist Task Force at that time, because I figured this would be more in line with what they might be looking into. And they came down and they took a look. But back in those years, their influences or their interests were more in domestic terrorism, particularly things like the FALN, BLA, groups like that. And there was more of an attitude, and this was not an agent and a cop came down. This is not their particular attitude, but institutionally, agency-wise, there was more of a feeling of hey, they're just blowing each other up in Lebanon. Let's worry about what's going on here. So it just shows the difference in the focus between what goes on. And then, it was more in the consulting business, after the Patriot Act and looking at bank transactions, what they're doing, along with the money laundering activities, we're also looking for terrorist financing activities. And sometimes there's differences, but sometimes they could be similar. But we would start to look for things like that. And it can be much more difficult because a lot of times the terrorist financing came from legitimate business that was then funneled off somewhere to support terrorist activities. Of course, they've gotten involved in plenty of criminal activities too. The cigarettes, the baby formula, things like that, all kinds of things like that, as well as other things, more straight up credit card fraud, illegal activities. But a lot of times it's a legitimate business and there's just some sympathies there. And they would send the money off to the certain charities. And that was another area of focus for the terrorist financing, because there are charities set up, and besides just helping needy people, they would funnel money off that they got collected as a charity, and again, funnel it to terrorist activities. So you're trying to see where that money went, and if these are legitimate entities, where it went, do the names match any names on any lists or anything like that. But there was a huge change in the focus of terrorism and terrorism financing. I don't know that they really even considered the terrorism financing back in the old days of those domestic groups. You'd have to ask somebody who was really there, but it didn't seem like it to me. And that was that one instance though, where we ran across something like that, and it just wasn't a lot of interest there. And then we had one other incident when I was in OSID. We were running our undercover operation that we had in the Trade Center, and a target came to us, was actually an Italian kid from Canada, and he was dropping us money off. So just to get off the Colombians, they weren't all Colombians, but they had the most money. So anyway, he came to us. He became a target of ours, and again, he became a target. We periodically have him under surveillance and do things. He ended up meeting one day with a guy, and they transacted for a huge amount of ecstasy pills. But the guy he got it from was a Chechnyan. And that guy had some ties to some other things as well. So you never know how it's all going to tie together or where it's going to come from.
And for my listeners, you mentioned the FALN. If you want to learn more about who they were, I have the miniseries Tales from the Boom Room, Profiles of the NYPD's Bomb Squad. Listen to what some of the Bomb Squad guys have to say about FALN. They are responsible for a lot of the bombings that you saw in New York City in the 1970s and 1980s. So you mentioned that case involving the Trade Center. We'll get to that in a second, because I have some photos here that Lieutenant Rose sent me that I want to share. Some of them are just, funny photos of promotions or the past, of course. So this first one, check you out. This is his retirement ID here for Lieutenant Rose when he retired in April of 2001. But some of this, the King's Flush, I guess, you kind of talked about it earlier. This is all the evidence that was seized, of course, from the King's Flush, right? Or one of them.
That's a portion of it. So we had to have some place to put all this stuff. So that's actually was the Whitestone Pound, the auto pound in Whitestone. So they cleared out some space. And so this was pretty much, if not every day, several times a week, we had another load of trucks to come through with this stuff. Okay.
And then, of course, this next photo that I'm going to share here is you standing right next to a former guest of this show, Chief Anamone, upon your promotion to lieutenant. This is 1995, 94.
I think that one might have been the promotion to Lieutenant Commander Detective Squad. Might have been. So it would have been 98.
Oh, 98. All right. Right before Anamone.
That's what that one was. I'm not sure. I think so.
Right before Anamone left, there's Anamone with the beaming smile. Louis, if you watch this one, I hope you enjoy that photo. This next one, if my screen will cooperate.
He was my XO in the 3-2 precinct. When I was in the 3-2 as a rookie.
Oh, really?
He was the XO there. Yeah.
Okay. So let me get to this next one here. I'm trying to get to the photo, but my tab here. Okay, good. This is the one I want to get to. So to set the stage, because some of you might not watch this on YouTube, but you'll listen to it. So you can't see this. This is an interesting operation. Now, I don't want to talk too much because obviously Lieutenant Rose will explain it, but there was a phony brokerage house set up in the Twin Towers of the World Trade Center, in which, of course, the anti-money laundering division were the ones behind it. They were working undercover. This is in the late 90s, heading into the early 2000s, obviously before the tragedy. And so this is one in which you were able to uncover $8 million in drug money. You can take it from there.
Yeah. So basically what we did, we set up an undercover investment firm. We took a little bit different of an angle from, say, the pickup operations and things like that. It's a long story about how it came about. But basically, we spent, at least a year just setting it up, getting all the backstopping done and things like that. And we set up as an investment firm, but we were willing to launder money for the bad guys. And we were able, so we'd have 4 detectives working up there every day. 2 as like investment advisors, 2 as secretaries, things like that. And I had selected the World Trade Center as this site, besides it was near the financial district and everything. But, and again, you got to go back in time a little bit. Things were a little different. So after the bombing in '93 in the garage in the World Trade Center, they started to require IDs to go up on the floors in the building. You couldn't just walk up. You had to go to a desk, and they would either call upstairs or give you a pass, something like that, before you could just go up to any particular office. So as a protection against the 2 things I had mentioned earlier, number 1, being ripped off by other bad guys, or number 2, having an incident with other law enforcement, this was a great situation. And also we set ourselves up a little differently. We weren't going to be street guys here. We weren't going to meet anybody on the street. If you wanted to, have us handle your money or whatever, you had to come to us and you had to bring it upstairs to us, where then we would count it up there. You leave, we would get it out to the bank. And the people that worked up there never brought the money out. It was always myself and some of the other detectives. So you never saw any of those guys working there ever with any bags or any money coming out. Guys and girls, I should say, up there. So that's why we ended up at the Trade Center, and that worked out well. And as it turned out, the only time we had to deal with an informant involved there was on the very first pickup, and it was an informant for another group in OCCB, and they had to move some money, and they needed it, and they reached out to me, and I just told them, okay, just tell them they can bring money to this spot and we'll take it. This way, the informant didn't really know, who we were, where we were. Nobody. It stayed completely undercover. And again, this took a lot of backstopping to do. We had a Series 7 licenses. We had a disciplinary history a little bit with the NASD. We had to deal with FinCEN and have them okay with us filing fictitious CTRs, which are currency transaction reports, for amounts over $10,000, and our amounts were way over $10,000. We had to get a bank to work with us, and accept our money, and then handle the wires that we were sending out. So there was a lot involved, but it all worked. So after that one time, we never dealt with an informant again, and our reputation kind of just spread through the money broker world down in Colombia. And again, elsewhere, as you can see, because we ended up with, although even the Italian kid from Canada, that was drug money, that was owed to Colombians, but at any rate, some Mexicans too. So after that, we would just get calls. And so then we would flip it back. So normally, you want to go deal with a bad guy, do something illegal. They want you to prove who you are and that you're not a cop and that you're okay.
Right.
Well, if they called us, we threw it back on them. Who are you? We don't know you. How'd you get our number? What is this all about? And the more we did that, the more they would insist on doing business with us.
Smart.
They would say, no, I'm okay. I work with so-and-so who just brought you X, Y, and Z. I'm in that office, or, from here and there. And sometimes we just say, no. And then we'd explain to them how we worked. And say, because typically, these, as I mentioned before, bad guys would meet on the corner and make the exchange.
Mhm.
So we don't do that. We're not, because our goal was also to ultimately try to get some of the trafficker money invested with us, have them invest with us, and then seize that money at the end of the day. That part of it was only mildly successful. There wasn't a lot of it, but a lot of the rest of it was. but we set ourselves up as that. So we're not going to pretend to be street guys. So we stuck to our plan. And so they say, okay, we have money, but you got to go meet this guy. So we say, no, we're not doing it.
Right.
And then, then they say, okay, we understand. I understand why that is, okay, I'll figure it out. We'll work it out. We'll get somebody to bring it up to you or whatever like that. And we went on and on like that. So the operation really, reaches out, blossoms. So we have as our subjects the people bringing us the money, like just as we did at the typical pickup operations. But in a lot of those operations, you couldn't use that evidence. It's a deal they had with those informants. They wouldn't testify, or it was a longer term thing, much longer. I mean, this was long, 3.5 years, but even longer than that. But since we had no informants involved, now when we were ready, we could arrest anybody we wanted without fear of disclosing anything else. And from a prosecutorial point of view, there was no issue with, hey, these are informants. Of course, they're going to lie, and they were getting paid. So we eliminated all those issues. But now, so we have our targets to do surveillance on, like we normally would. The guys, I'm going to go back to the stash house, watch them do other pickups, whatever it might be. But we could also go up on the phones. So when they called us from a phone, and we would get the phone records, and we thought that phone looked good, or we thought that phone looked good from doing surveillance on them, we'd go up on wires on those phones. Then we had the other side of it was we would send money out, but then we would start to trace the money through those accounts and look at what else was going on in the accounts that they sent that money to. And this is where IRS, CID, those guys are great. They're great at what they do. They played a huge role in that for us. And that's where myself and the other guys learned a whole lot from them in how to do that. And that became very useful later on in the consulting business at the banks. But, we owe them a debt of gratitude for that. And they were a big part of helping us. So then you had tracing those accounts and the money in those accounts. Where else did it go from those accounts? Putting together seizure warrants at the end of the day. And then one of the money brokers we would deal, and so just to get back to, them, wanting to make them prove themselves to us, we tell them, well, we need once or twice with them, we need to meet. So we wanted them to come to New York. Of course, they wouldn't come to New York. They wanted us to go to Colombia. We weren't going to go to Colombia. But I had other contacts through a variety of other things in the Caribbean, not far off the coast of Colombia. So I was able to set something up where we could meet them there. And so that's what we would do, and meet them in person and go forward from there. So then they know us, we know them. Then sometimes the biggest problem would be they want to send us too much money. We didn't want to take too much money. But once they trust you, they want to get as much as they can through you. So now the operation's going. We've got surveillances, we've got wires, we've got tracing accounts. Then one of these money brokers we were dealing with, she sends her kids up here to work to the US. And they were at the time, I think, 16 and 17. And she basically wanted us to set them up. One of them ended up going down to Florida after a little while. And the other one, the younger one, the 16-year-old, stayed up here to work. So she wanted us to set them up, to get them an apartment, to get them a phone, and do things like that. And they would go out, do those pickups of the money, and then bring it to us. But now they would talk to their mother over the phones we gave them. So naturally, before we ever gave them that phone, we were up on it.
Yeah.
So now they were our unwitting undercovers. So, and we knew they were taking, before, if they weren't going to bring the money directly to our office, they were going to bring it back to the apartment that we got for them and go back there. So we'd have them kind of do the street work for us. We watched them. We always covered it. There were some funny things that happened with those things, but they did that. So then they were basically working for us without knowing it.
I mean, if they ever wanted to be cops in the future, I mean, hey, listen, I did undercover work. I had some experience, So
I'll tell you one funny one real quick, because this was a good one. And
please.
A lot of these targets we dealt with, they were really good at what they do. I mean, when you look at how those Colombian cartels were working and the people, it works more like espionage cells than it did like, the wise guys. The wise guys, if you lose them, well, in a day or two, you're going to pick him up unless he's on the run at home, at the club or at his girlfriend's house.
Right.
That's where you're going to find them. These guys were like ghosts. They come in from South America. There's nothing in their name, not a car, not a registration, not an apartment, not an address, nothing. We'd have to follow them and put them to bed somewhere, make sure they were in for the night, and then be back early the next morning to see where they were going to go. So it was a lot different like that. So one time the kids got the call over the phone we're up on from Colombia, say, okay, these guys got money for you. They're going to call this number. And that's not sometimes how we go up on the other phones, because then they call from our phone to that phone. And get a call, take care of it. And I think it was $500,000. It was 400, 500, something like that. So it's on a weekend now that this comes in. So now, only the guys in the plant in the wire where we monitor the wires are really working. Everybody else is kind of off. But we got to scramble. We got to get in. I'll try to make this short, but
that's
so
fine.
the kid gets the call. They tell him to meet him. It was on a corner in Times Square. So now we're scrambling from home and everything, in our cars, get to Times Square, set up on the corner. Because a lot of times what we were able to do, again, these detectives that work for me were really sharp. They could spot the guy waiting for either us or for that, like in this case, for the kid, before the kid found him. And if we felt it was the right time, sometimes, and it wasn't going to harm the operation, we would hit them before they ever made that drop. And it would never come to us. We'd never have to put it through or anything like that. But anyway, so we go to that corner, we're looking around, we don't see anything. The kid gets another call. Okay, come back over to it was on the east side somewhere. It was in the 20s on 2nd Avenue or something like that. Come over here. Now the kid, and he didn't have a car. He didn't know how to drive. So he hops in the subway. Now guys, my guys got to hop out of their cars, leave him in Times Square, get on the subway with the kid and tell us, exactly where he is. Meanwhile, we're driving, scrambling to get over to the east side, and the ones that would stay in the cars as quickly as possible. So we get over there, kid's standing around, he gets another call from these people. And we're looking around to see these people. We're trying to pick them out. Sometimes we can. These guys, we could never spot them. But they call the kid, they say, tell him, turn around, in the middle of the block, there's a brown car. The keys are in the car, keep the car. Now the kid doesn't know what to do. He's 16 years old. He's in Manhattan. He doesn't know how to drive, at least as far as he has no license. I mean, I'm sure of that.
Yeah.
And he kind of stands there like a deer in the headlights. He walks down the block. He sees the car. We see the car now, and he looks around. He gets back in the car. He calls the other bad guys back. Said, "Okay, I'm going to take the car." And I'm going to drive it around the corner, and I'm going to take the bag and leave the car. And they tell him, no. The car is a gift from us to you. Keep the car. So just to show you how sophisticated some of these people are, they had a car. They obviously had it registered to something that wasn't going to come back to anything. And that price of ditching that car was just part of the cost of doing business to be secure. So
Right.
They never showed up in person.
They did it over the phone.
If they were there, we couldn't spot them, but they might have been there at all. So anyway, the kid gets in the car, sits there for about 20 minutes in the car behind the wheel, trying to figure out what to do. Then finally he takes the car and he drove up a few blocks by the Citibank building, Citicorp building, up in, 51st or something like that, 53rd. And he parks the car and he gets out and he takes the duffel bag out of the trunk. And it's a big heavy duffel bag. He takes it out and he starts walking to the subway. He doesn't know what to do with the car, so he just abandons the car. He starts walking. While he's walking to the subway, the strap on the duffel bag breaks. He's got like $500,000 there, which is heavy.
Yeah.
So now he's dragging this bag, lugging it down to the subway. And now we have to send a couple of guys on the subway with him because he's getting on there with a bag with $500,000.
What could go wrong?
To go back, yeah. And eventually he's taking it back to the apartment, that he picked up. But the funniest part was he calls his brother in Miami. And he tells him, what happened? Yeah, these guys, they couldn't. He goes, it was just like the movies. That's what he tells his brother.
It kind of is. It kind of is,
Yeah.
right? If you think about it, I mean, it really is. It's like straight up something out of like Scarface or something like that. So, and I don't want to keep you too long because you've been so generous for your time. And I really, this is like mind blowing. I never knew the intricacies of this. This is like so fun to listen to. It's captivating. April of 2001, the big payoff of the investigation that took a few years to do using the Trade Center, of course, and it makes sense to use the Trade Center because, of course, when we think of the Trade Center now, we think of the tragedy, of course. But back then, I mean, listen, it was the financial landmark of the world. I mean, the name tells you World Trade. It had so many legitimate financial corporations in it, many investment firms, Morgan Stanley, Avon Corp, a lot. So it had the pristine reputation to where you wouldn't think twice about a brokerage firm being there. It made sense. But April of 2001, after 21 and a half years, not quite 22, because your 22nd anniversary will come in November of that year. You call it a career. You're having a lot of fun, but obviously it is a lot of work. What prompted you to leave the NYPD in April of 01?
Well, it's kind of like guys will tell you when it's time, it's time. So, I never minded a lot of work. There was always a lot of work to do. But politics and bureaucracy can get in the way of things a little bit. So that operation was a lot of work. Number one, well, there was like a year of the backstopping, finding a place, signing leases, getting equipment, getting furniture, the broker terminals, all those things. All right, but that was done. Now we're running the operation, but you still got to pay the normal business bills. You got to pay the rent. We're up on wires. We have targets everywhere. We're tracing money through accounts. And again, it's a long story about how this came about, this operation, but there was a police commissioner and the Manhattan DA, Mr. Morgenthau at the time. It's not exactly like they wanted this done, but they wanted something done. It was their idea. Now years go by and we're pretty successful. We're going along, but there's new chiefs, there's new commissioners. The DA's office was the same. So it became a little difficult sometimes to explain to the new guys what's going on. And especially if they didn't come from any kind of an investigative background and they're not familiar with what goes on in the money laundering operations. And you're explaining what you do, and they're kind of like, you do what? With how much money? You met them where? You were in what country? Things like that. And, it started to become a little micromanaged, and the deal always was the IRS picked up our overtime for this operation. So it cost the city nothing. We were making money on the money we picked up, 7 points, which was more than the typical operation. But again, that went towards our credibility of not just being these either law enforcement or these typical bad guys on the street. So then there's the seizure money, which was all, asset forfeiture and seizure like that. So there's a ton of money. Our overtime's being paid. We're running this operation. We're running all over the place. And then it was like, well, we don't know if you should always stay, on these targets or whatever for the overtime. Why don't you call the office first before you're going to stay? And I thought it was a little ridiculous, but I said, all right, big deal. They want to call that we're going to stay on these targets. I'll do it. And then one day I called up and I said, yeah, these guys look good. We're going to give them some time. And, not every surveillance leads to a seizure. A lot of them do, a lot of them don't. It takes a lot of work. I said, but I think they look good and we're going to stay. And then on the other end of the phone, I heard, well, I don't know if you should really stay, on that. And I was like, are you going to run this from an office down there in 1PP, or am I going to run it here? Especially, it's not costing you a penny.
Right.
You're making a lot of money. So it was all the work. It was that kind of thing. And then it's like, we made a lot less overtime, believe it or not, than a lot of other units than say narcotics units doing buy and bust and things like that. And nothing against them, they deserve everything they get.
Right.
Here we are doing this at a way higher level with way more money involved, the stuff that's paying for all those drugs that are out on the street. And now we're going to be micromanaged like that. And, like I said, it was a ton of work. And anybody that's done any kind of these operations, they'll tell you it's 24/7 work. It's no, you go home and it's over. Never. between what's coming over wires and you have to react to, what subjects are doing on surveillance they're doing. And when you're just sitting there thinking constantly in your sleep, even about what are you going to do? If X happens, are we going to do Y? How are we going to handle this? We don't want to burn the operation. We don't want to burn, the undercover. We don't want to burn anybody else involved. We don't want to get people killed, down the road. How are we going to make this? We're always trying to make something look like something it's not. So it's 24 hours a day. And anybody that's done these kind of things, they'll tell you, that's run them, they'll tell you that that's how it is. So between that and then being micromanaged, I had my time in, and people tell you it's just when it's time, it's time. So I decided to retire, and I told the DA's office. And by the way, they were great partners. I got to mention Jill Mariani's name. She was the ADA that was in charge on their side, put in countless hours on this between, wires and warrants and everything else, and helping get everything set up with FinCEN, with the SEC. So I just mentioned that, I'm going to retire. And then they came back to me and said, well, would you consider working as a consultant for us on the same, it's called Blue Chip, Operation Blue, on Blue Chip. And I thought about it and I said, why not? Same guys, same work, much less responsibilities, another paycheck and not dealing with one PP. So I said, sure, I'll do it. So that's what happened.
And you mentioned turning point. The turning point, of course, for my listeners is during the Giuliani administration. I often make the joke that they had about as many police commissioners as Spinal Tap had drummers, because there was Bill Brandt from 94 to 96, and then Howard Safer, who was the fire commissioner from April of 1996 until August of 2000. When Safer left for the private sector after retiring as commissioner, Bernie Carrick came in and he handled the duties of NYPD commissioner from 2000 until the end of the Giuliani administration in December of 2001. So when he talked about the change, that change occurred in August of 2000. And of course, it's not easy to explain all of that to newer people, as we talked about. So you have AML Consulting Services, and that's, you're the president of that. So it keeps you busy. What do you enjoy most about it? And what are some of the more notable interactions that you've had?
Well, so there's another thing where, things worked out well. I was in the right place at the right time. I had no great plan. I had no great business plan. But the Patriot Act changed everything in the regulatory world, as far as the financial institutions, the banks in particular. So things we had wanted as law enforcement for many years and, lobbied Congress through various means or whatever, to have certain measures put in place or regulations or laws changed, we're always shot down because, the bank lobbyists have a lot more money than any law enforcement lobbyists have. But the Patriot Act kind of changed that around very quickly, almost instantly. And there was now much more of an emphasis on banks knowing their customers, detecting and reporting suspicious transactions, filing suspicious activity reports. And then basically what happened was HSBC came under the Federal Reserve scrutiny. And they were put under what's called a look back order. And it's the first one, certainly the first big one that I'm aware of, basically telling them they have to go back a certain period of time, whether it's 6 months or a year, and review their certain types of transactions, in this case, wire transfers. And there was a couple of other things too, but to see if there was any suspicious activity in there that they missed. So that was like a big change. So people I knew that became involved with that reached out to me, said, would you want to come over and try that, do something here, set up the investigative end of it or whatever. And I said, sure. And me not being the great businessman that I am, I said to myself, hey, this is great, but this is like a great gig for 6 months or something like that. And after all this publicity, all the money this is going to cost the banks, any fines that they may come up with, the other banks are going to see this. And, they're going to get on board. And obviously the complete opposite happened, because here we are all these years later, and the banks are still getting in trouble and still coming under these orders. But it became a great business. And again, it's just like a lot of on-the-job learning, a big learning process. So, before when I was still on the PD and doing things, we would always be disgruntled about the banks. They're not giving us this, they're not giving us that. They're playing games with us, and there was also an attitude of, hey, if I see this, you must know, because you've got to know a lot more than I do. Your bankers, these are your customers. You've got to know way more than we know about it. But yet you're like kind of to us, stalling us or whatever, not giving us the information. Anyway, as it turns out, there was some of that, but they just really didn't know. Compliance was always underfunded, understaffed. It's a cost center. It costs them money. It doesn't make money. And banks are businesses. They do what makes them money. If they're not required to do something else, they're not going to do it. Now, even they're required, and sometimes they don't do it. But it's a different, it's a little different. It's changed. So when you got inside the bank, now working with them, you came to realize they really just don't know. They're not looking because they were never required to look. It's just business. Hey, it's good business, right?
Yeah.
Got the account, all this money's going through. They didn't know anything. They didn't look into what kind of business. They didn't look into the people that were there. They didn't look into where the transactions were really going or anything like that. So it was a little bit of an eye opener to see, all right, maybe they did jerk us around and stall us once in a while, but really they just don't know. They don't have the training. They don't have the experience. They don't have the systems in place. So, that was pretty much an eye opener for me. And it became a good business because in 6 months, other banks didn't clean up their act. So we just kept going and going, and jobs got bigger and bigger.
And of course, the service is AML Consulting Services, Inc. Well, it's been a great podcast. And I want to conclude now with the segment of this podcast called Rapid Fire. But for my listeners, you know it well by now. It's 5 hit and run questions from me and 5 answers from you. Are you ready?
Sure.
All right. First, favorite colleague or colleagues you ever had? You can say multiple.
Yeah, I mean, you know what? I don't want to leave anybody's name out, but as I had mentioned earlier in the podcast, I've always been so lucky to have great partners, great training officers, great colleagues across the board, counterparts in other agencies and other places. So I don't want to leave anybody out, but I was just very lucky in that regard.
That's fine. Second one, and you can say pass in this rapid fire, and here's why. Because sometimes these stories aren't necessarily G-rated, and that is the funniest call you ever responded to.
Well, first of all, we always had a lot of laughs. That was the best part of the job, was working with all the guys and girls and all the laughs we had. We were always having a lot of laughs. So there were a lot of funny things, but I'll give you one story that's sort of like PG rated. So I worked for a little while in the Manhattan North Task Force. And during my time there, they started a detail called the Quality of Life Detail. At the time, like the big boombox radios blasting were a big issue, but there were other things too. And basically this detail came up, and myself and 3 other cops went into it. And we basically had the entire 5th Division, which is, the Upper West Side of Manhattan, 24, 30, 34, 20, no, 20, no, we're in the 24, 24, 26, 30, and 34. And, we had to give out a certain amount of those boombox summonses and take them. And other than that, it was whatever we wanted to do, any collars you could make. So, and we didn't have to be in one precinct for any particular night. We could go up and down all night long, wherever we wanted to go. Anyway, so we're up in the 3-4 one night. I'm working with my partner. I'll call him Mike and just leave it at that. And we stopped a motorcycle with 2 people on it on Audubon Avenue. It was up, I guess, in the 170s, high 170s. So the driver and the passenger both had full face helmets on. So I was dealing with the driver, and I'm getting the license and registration. And then I hear my partner, Mike, and he was a very pale-skinned guy. I hear him say, "Oh, you're a girl." And I look up, and he has his hand inside the person's jacket, right about chest level. And he's turning beet red. And he starts, but he's not moving his hand. And he starts stammering, going, I saw a bulge. I thought there was a bulge. I thought there was something there, but his hand's not moving. So at this point, I can't even control myself. I just gave the guy his license and registration back. And I went back to the car, and I was laughing so hard I was crying. I sit there for about 10 minutes. to compose myself. And he's explaining to me, trying to explain to me, no, the jacket was like open. And I saw a bulge in there, so I reached in there. I go, yeah, but Mike, once you said it wasn't a gun, why didn't you take your hand out? He was just too flustered to do anything like that.
And it's convenient his name was Mike, because that is something that was fully something I would do. That, you know, the intention is not malicious. It's just you're doing your job, and you know, something like that happens. But that's funny.
And we had made a lot of gun collars, so it was a legitimate concern.
Right. It makes sense. Of course, you know, but then of course he found out the hard way. No. And it's not what I think it is. So third, favorite bar or restaurant in New York City?
Well, you know, I'll probably divide that a little bit in between when I was on the job and when I was consulting.
Mm-hmm.
So when I was working, of course, there's the famous or infamous Woe Hops in Chinatown. So we would just spend a lot of time in court, you know, in Lower Manhattan. You know, everybody pretty much hits Woe Hop at one point or another. And, you know, they were open very late too. So, you know, if you were making a call or dropping something off and something like that. So that was, you know, that was a popular place. It was always good. Luna's in Little Italy. We used to go there a lot. And there was a place in the 3-4. We used to call it Dirty Bob's. I don't know if it ever had a real name or if there was a name on it.
That could have been the name screening.
He was on Broadway, not far from the 3-4 station house. He was in another location at 3-4 before, but he eventually moved down there. And it was one guy working there by himself, and everything was on the grill at the same time. But I mean, if you went there for breakfast, you know, and you wanted like, you know, French toast and sausage and chocolate milk, basically you got about a half a loaf of bread, sausages the size of kielbasa. For chocolate, they gave you like a quart container where you poured half the milk out and put some syrup in and did that. If you went for lunch, you know, you take a big handful of ground beef, throw it on the grill, but roast beef, everything was on the grill at once. And he was there all by himself, but huge portions of food. And I'm sure some of your other listeners from up there, they'll remember that place. And, you know, what you got might taste a little bit like everything else on the grill, but it was all good. And we used to go there for breakfast or lunch a lot. And then, you know, of course, now in the consulting business, you know, we're working in these banks or whatever. We're kind of thinking with big shots. So we're going to Del Frisco's, you know, for lunch or dinner. And to me, Del Frisco's is the best steakhouse. Or go to Morton's or something like that, you know, when we're just acting like big shots going there. But it was good. We ate well. We still eat well.
Of course. That's the thing I always say, you know, I haven't been into the city since the pandemic hit. I'll be going back finally soon. And that's the thing I miss the most, because the thing that I've said before, and I know for my listeners, I sound like a broken record and they probably want to strangle me by now. We get the point. But the thing is about New York is that the cuisine, if you're a Hispanic guy like me, you want Spanish food, you got it. You want Italian food, you got it. You want Middle Eastern food, you got it. Anything you want, it's there. The variety is such that you can't go wrong. Your palate is diversified 10 times. You know, it's amazing.
I left out a ton of places. You know, we'd be on Roosevelt Avenue, good places for a roast con pollo and other things. Wherever we were, we usually managed to. You know, there were days you're eating a lot in your car with, you know, Chinese food in your lap, and of course, as soon as you get it, you got to take off and stuff's flying all over. But we, as you said, there's a variety of cuisines. They're all good, and there was a ton of places we used to eat at that I always enjoyed.
Absolutely. So fourth, I know you said that you didn't really know what you wanted to do earlier when we were talking about your background in the podcast, but if not for the NYPD, if you could think of any other career that you would have pursued and had some fun with, what career would that be?
Well, a career in the NHL would have been nice, except for a complete lack of talent and ability kind of ruled that out. But besides that, I don't know if there's any other job that I could have stayed at for over 20 years, either because I would stay or I'd get fired or something like that. So it was just a real good mix. It just suited me well. And I can't really imagine. And I got called for other jobs while I was on the PD. I eventually got called for some other things, and I just turned them all down because I was just having too much fun.
Right. So listen, you could have played on the first line with Messier and Graves, you know, and had Brian Leach on back of you, but you made out okay in your own right. So fifth and finally, what advice would you give a young police officer coming on the job now?
So that's a very tough one. You know, I never thought I'd really see things the way they are today. I mean, the police have always been a scapegoat. You've always been the politician's punching bag, but now they're changing laws that basically make it impossible for you to do your job. And I never thought I'd come to the point where I wouldn't be able to recommend the job to somebody. And again, every generation has seen the job change. when I came on, and there were guys that came on in the 50s, some of them, they'd be telling you, oh, the job's dead, the job sucks, or this and that. And things change for them. But I don't think anything compares to what's going on today. But, I would maybe I would tell them three things maybe. First, look out for your partner and your other colleagues, because they're the only ones that are going to always have your back when things get rough. Nobody else. So that would be one thing. The other thing would be to learn how to talk to people. There are so many, and that doesn't mean you let your guard down. You never let your guard down. But there are ways to talk to people when you do things, and even walk away from, an enforcement situation or a stop, or in a situation where somebody has a hostile attitude, and you could walk away shaking hands with them saying, oh, okay, thanks. That happened numerous, not always, could make everybody happy. And you can always escalate, but learning how to talk to people, especially when you have to do something, while at the same time watching them carefully, and then the third thing I'd say, which goes along with that, is to listen to people. If somebody comes up and they want to talk to you, or they want to tell you something, whether it's a guy in the cells, it could even be somebody that appears to be an EVP on the street. It could be a guy that is a bad guy, criminal. People have all kinds of motivations for wanting to tell you something. And a lot of times they can, you'll learn to separate the wheat from the chaff, and when to walk away. But I can't tell you how many times we started great cases or came up with great arrests or things like that, just listening to somebody that wanted to talk. So.
Absolutely. Always have that intuitive ear. So that concludes what's been a really fun episode of the Mike Damon podcast. I'd like to thank our mutual friend, Bob Geist, for turning me on to you. And so it's a good thing that he did that. I'm glad that we were able to chat. So I look forward to putting this up on YouTube and everywhere else that you get your podcast, so that, the listeners can hear this great conversation.
Bob's another member of Police Academy class 79-4.
I keep telling him, he comments frequently on my stuff on YouTube. I said, Bob, I want to hear your war stories too. If you want to come on the show, hey, let me know. He'd be a great guest too. So hopefully he can be on someday. Yeah, me too. So before we go, is there anything that you'd like to plug? I'll plug myself in a second, but anything you want to put out there?
No, not really. I mean, most of my business and my work comes from referral and reputation. And it's people that they're in the banks already. They're at banks that we've worked with in the past that then move to another institution who needs something. I've worked along with all the big consulting firms and big law firms. So I really don't know what to plug. We're out there. We're eager to help, whether it's with reviewing transactions, helping with know your customer, training, whatever it might be. But I don't really need to plug anybody. I do appreciate the opportunity.
No problem. It was a pleasure to have you. Pleasure's all mine. So on my end, for listeners out there, if you don't know where to find me by now, if you have any sports related inquiries for the podcast, we do it all. We don't just do law enforcement, we do sports, news, and the fire service. So on the sports end, if you want to reach me, we do have some interesting guests from that field in the works. I don't want to say them quite yet. You can reach me at 917-727-0891 for that particular business line, or you can email me, Colón on sports, COLON on sports @gmail.com. On the other ends, for any other inquiry, news, fire service, law enforcement, for the podcast business line, 917-781-6189. Email Colón Report, the Colón Report, I should say, THECOLON Report @gmail.com. You can find the podcast anywhere. We're on Apple, we're on Spreaker, Spotify, you name it. And of course, in video form on YouTube. MC's Audio is the name of my channel, MC''S Audio. Coming up on the Mike Damon Podcast Tuesday, as I said before, is the continuation of the miniseries Tales from the Boom Room, profiles the NYPD's bomb squad. Retired NYPD bomb squad detective Dan McNally returns to the Mike Damon Podcast as we do a deep dive into 1996 crash of TWA Flight 800, which he had a big hand in investigating. It's been 25 years. You heard the perspective of one detective, Don Sadawi. You'll hear Dan's on Tuesday. So all that being considered and said, on behalf of retired Lieutenant Ron Rose, I am Mike Colón, and we will see you next time. Take care, everyone.